So this is From Data to Dollars, Making Your Municipal Shelter's Case for Funding. My name is Caitlin Durkin. I'm the manager for Network Partner Relationships at Best Friends Animal Society. And I'm really excited to be here with you today. Let's try to get you some more money. I think you all could use it to reach these big goals. First, though, I'm going to make you sit through some boring stuff. So housekeeping, we are going to ask you to engage with us in two ways on this Zoom. The first you are already doing, that's our webinar chat. And that is a great place to interact with us, comment on what you're hearing, talk to other attendees. If you have questions for the panelists, we ask that you put that into the Q&A section. If you put it in the chat, then it just scrolls through and then I lose it and I can't look at it. But if you put in the Q&A, I can see it until it's been answered. We will do our best to answer all of your questions. We probably won't be able to, but we still keep record and use it to inform network communications in the future. So please let us know what you're thinking, what you're worrying about. Feedback. So we hope that you're able to reduce distractions a little bit, kind of focus on this, but I know you're really busy people. I want to use your time well. So we're going to ask you a 1-question survey at the end of this webinar. Just let us know how we did so we can make sure we keep improving. We're continue to serve you. And we will also make this webinar recording available in about 3 business days. We are also for this one going to include the slide deck because we have a good number of resources on this for you all. Zoom likes to be tricky, so I always do a little Zoom tour because at this point we should all know it, but somehow it's always changing things. So you've got your chat. Make sure you select to send to everyone. It's probably going to default you to send to just hosts and panelists, and we'd love for you to interact with your peers as well. Your Q&A is the one I marked in the red box. We also have captions enabled, but if you want to see them, you're going to have to enable that on your account as well. So I put that in the purple. So you want to get it to where it says hide captions because that means that they are showing already. Okay, boring stuff over. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists. First, we have Kelsey Knight, manager of Washington Parish Animal Shelter. That's in Franklinton, Louisiana. This is a smaller organization, so about 200 intakes in 2024 with about a $200,000 budget. Kelsey, I'm so excited for her to be here because every single year she has to make a case for her budget. There's no ongoing budget. It's like every year she has to use data to make that case. And so she's very experienced in that area. Scott Trebatoski is going to bring in a little bit of a bigger shelter perspective on this. He's the director of Hillsborough County Pet Resource Center in Tampa, Florida. They did about 13,000 intakes last year with about an $11.6 million budget. And then finally, we have Whitney Bollinger. She's the Director of Strategy and Network Operations at Best Friends Animal Society. She also used to work as the director at Dallas Animal Services. And so that experience in large municipal budgeting is something that she's going to bring into this. With that, we're going to have Whitney start us off with a presentation on some resources that you can use after this webinar to help you adapt the information that you're going to get here to your specific circumstances. So please start us off with Whitney.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Just to give you some context of how to use this deck, what we're going to go through, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of small text. It's not intended to be something that we would talk through and discuss here during this webinar, but for you to bring back to your shelter and review when you're working on your own budget proposals. The concept is that it will help you approach your budget through a new lens. So you may be thinking about data in some of these ways and using data in to support your budget proposals in some of the ways we outline here, but maybe it'll spark a new idea or a new framework. There's a lot of placeholder data that's in the deck, but there's also some linked sources, both in the examples and a lot at the end to kind of help you with some reference points. So high level, the deck is going to help you to make sure that you're really thinking about who your audience is, what they care about, who they listen to, because as you know, they may not have the same priorities that you do. And for a lot of government shelters, life saving is not necessarily the metric that is going to be the most impactful or convincing for them. So you can think about how you tell your story in around life saving in ways that matter and really influence the decision makers. It is going to help you to think about ways you can support your proposals and your arguments with qualitative and quantitative data, and tie that data back to that audience's bottom line and stay laser focused on that audience's purpose and goals. So this slide will kind of talk you through some potential bottom line or focuses for your audience. Remember, depending on who you're speaking to, you may be speaking to a city manager, a board, a county board, a member of the media or of the public if you're trying to get some additional support behind you and your proposal, and you want to make sure you're tailoring your message to whomever that audience is. So think about things like efficacy and efficiency, accountability to constituents, pillars that your local government has really espoused that they prioritize, and then budgeting priorities. What are they focused on this year? For a lot of cities and counties, that could be public safety, it could be public health, and there are impacts from a shelter perspective that relate to public safety and public health. And if you can find ways to tie your proposals to those issues, it can be very powerful. Okay, so this will kind of walk you through a thought exercise when you're coming to look at enhancing your budget, adding additional funds. So what is the problem you're trying to solve? Who does it impact? And what is the solution? And that includes some of the data to be considering, and how would it impact quality of life, public safety, public health, community pride? Is a neighboring community doing something that you're not? And is that something that you can use as part of your case? And then, of course, you want to show them that you can track the return on their investment. So track how that funding made an impact. That can be very powerful as well, especially in securing funding the following year. So then this is an example that you can read through of a municipal shelter that's looking to get an additional full-time staff person to help with adoption and foster support, some of the data that could potentially be used to support that. And Caitlin, if you'll go to the next slide for me. This, again, very dense. We're not going to go through this, but it's something for you to read through on your own. Depending on the formality of your local government, this may or may not be the right approach in terms of actual points, but it will help you get thinking about how you could frame your problems with data, how you can frame impact and why it matters with data, and how you can frame the actual resolution that this enhancement would bring with data. And both internal data, your own data, and then data that's available publicly or from external sources, which we've got some resources on that later on. Okay. Again, with reductions, so if they're looking to take money from you, think about what that loss would look like in terms of your services. Are there goals that you've set that are important to the community that you wouldn't be able to meet, including trying to attain no kill or sustain no kill? Will it impact other costs? Sometimes by cutting one service, you find that you spend more in another area and it ends up being more efficient to keep the funding in the way it already was. Community impacts. Are there constituents that are going to call and complain about this cut or about the impacts caused by this cut? Are there any residents or communities within your area that are going to be disproportionately impacted, maybe senior citizens or people that are lower income or have less access to transportation? Is there any safety risks that could come as a result of these cuts? And then long-term implications. Does it have any implications on maybe ongoing bond projects or your city's growth plan? What message is it sending to the community? And how does it reflect on your city's mission or guiding principles and values? And here we have an example of a shelter that when asked to propose a cut for their budget, they've reluctantly proposed to cut a vacant animal control officer position, which would result in them removing their overnight shift. And they've done that because that has the least direct impact on current staff, on daily operations, public safety, and life saving, but it does have very real implications. And so here's some of the data that could be useful in making that kind of case. And then on the next slide, there's some examples of how you could use data to tell that kind of story. Okay, the next slide. Some things to consider if you're trying to, whether it's a reduction or an enhancement, you're trying to ask for money or trying to prevent money from being cut. There's some correlations that you might want to think through. So if it has to do with your outcomes or your length of stay, think about, does it impact the cost of care? How does it impact vet costs? How does it impact your save rate? Unfortunately, euthanasia is a cost. There's a cost associated with that, both emotional and also fiscal, which is not pleasant to talk about, but it's something to consider when you're talking about budgets, and trying to make a case that life-saving is the right solution. You can sometimes make that case from a fiscal perspective with that as well. The community perception. If you're thinking about trying to increase something in the realm of technology, or would that improve your data reporting? Is that something your city or your county value? Could it improve efficiency? And what would that result in? Would you be able to do more service requests? Would you be able to do more adoptions, more spay and neuters? Would it help with your security? These are all things just as thought exercises to think through, that often correlate and can be used to support your points. And then think about whether you want to tell your data, when you're telling your story, if you want to use data that highlights trends over time, like year over year, or even one quarter compared to another quarter. These are some of the data points that often lend well to that. Trends over time, they'll illustrate your increase or decreases. Often if you have received a cut and you wanted to last year and you want to show how that has negatively impacted your department, a trend over time is going to be a good way of doing that. You can also demonstrate surge periods like kitten season and how costs are impacted during that time. Looking at things in terms of the day of the week and the time that they occur can be helpful, especially when you're considering adding or removing staff or updating your service hours. That is kind of covered in the adoption and foster example. Another option is considering location. So when you're pulling your report data, you could pull a zip code, cross street, a jurisdiction, depending on how you have logged your data. And that can help illustrate concentrations of need or missed opportunities. Maybe you are seeing really low adoption rates in half of your community. And what can you do to increase adoption rates there? Maybe they have trouble getting to your shelter and you would be successful if you did offsite events in that area. Those are the kinds of things that can be helpful with location. And it can help illustrate specific impacts on specific constituents. So then we've got some resources on the places you can find data. Shelter Pet Data Alliance is a great resource. I know we'll talk about that a little bit more. That will help you illustrate your existing data if you're up to date and you're continuing to submit your data with us. And you can also pull reports from your shelter management software, your clinic software. If you've got visitor logs, that can be a great source of data, or caller dispatch logs. And then this slide has some resources for not only Shelter Pet Data Alliance and One Alliance, which allows you to compare your data and trends with other organizations across the country, and you can refine them based on organization type, location, intake size, social vulnerability index. If you're rural or urban, it's really powerful. And it gives you visuals that you can use right there. It also includes some research that Best Friends has done with our experts internally, and also some access to peer-reviewed journals that can be used to tell the story of what anything from stories about compassion fatigue and burnout and the implications that has on organizations, to proven best industry practices. And then we've got some data from the government, primarily from census data, that can help you with demographics for your community, trends for your community, income levels, education levels, things like that. So we invite you to dig into this at a later date, and hope that it is helpful in helping you kind of think through ways you can strengthen your argument and embrace data and include more data in your proposals this year.
Thank you, Whitney. I'm really excited about this, and I really hope our attendees are able to use the information you provided to both frame their asks, make sure that they are thinking about their audience, about what's going to be persuasive for that audience, but also like resources to get the evidence that proves their claims. With that, I'm going to make Kelsey brag about herself a little bit. I know told you all that Kelsey has to make the pitch for her budget every single year. And it's a good transition from Whitney's point, because she does this in a very data-focused way using Shelter Pet Data Alliance. So Kelsey, can you tell us about something that you've done in this budgeting world that you're really proud of, and the way that you use data to make that point?
Yeah, so I'll start by giving a little bit of background. So this Washington Parish itself did not have any animal shelter, animal control. They had nothing. And then in August of 2019, we had a parish president that wanted to get reelected. So he said, well, I'm going to build a shelter. And they built it with no funding. And I'm sure a lot of us are used to that. You know, there's just the empty building. Let's make that an animal shelter. Well, they chose the wrong person for the job, because I came in and I was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, it's going to be something. You're not just going to be 4 years down the road and shut it down. Well, they put me in the position, but they were like, well, you actually don't have any dedicated funding at all. You're running off of money that we have saved because we didn't have animal control. So they didn't do any kind of rabies testing. So all of the money that we were getting from the state to do rabies control and testing, that was getting put into an account. And so that is the money they used to open our shelter. And every single year, that money gets lower and lower and lower and lower in that account. And every single year, they're like, well, we should just throw that money here or throw that money here. And every year, at the end of the year, I have to go in front of the council, parish president, everybody, and say, actually, you can't do that, because at this point, like there'll be a whole riot. So yeah, you can't just shut us down. You're gonna find me money, and we're gonna be cool for next year. And so really, all your council wants to see is data and where the money's going. All your public wants to see is data, what the money's being used for, and what you're doing for the community. And it's kind of the same thing, you know, with your supervisors and stuff. As long as you can prove to them that what you're getting is going back out and you're moving forward, most of the time they're going to kind of leave you alone. We still don't have animal control, so we don't have that revenue source, even, you know, like you know, parish tags or anything like that. Like, we have, from the baseline, without us doing any extra work, we have nothing that comes in. So when I realized this, I was like, okay, how do I go about getting data? Because I don't have anything. Like, we're just taking in dogs and the dogs are going out, but I have nothing to show or prove or do anything. And then SPDA came out and I was like, oh, this is nice. This has a lot of data and I don't have to do any legwork at all. It's just there. I just put my numbers into PetPoint and then it does all of this cool stuff for me. So I use SPDA probably monthly to go into my main office and my council and see, like, this is what we're doing. Look what we're doing. Last year, we only took in 157 dogs. This year, we took in 220 dogs. Look at how, much we've grown and how much we've done. Another thing that I feel is kind of shocking is our biggest revenue source is spay neuter. That is our biggest income for the shelter, is doing spay neuters for the public, local shelters, local rescues, especially our cats. We can do 30 some odd cats a day at $25, and that pays for all of my staff for the day. Electrical, it doesn't pay for our water bill, but that's kind of negligible. And we actually have revenue come in from that clinic. And that's kind of how we run day to day. As I look at how much we spent yesterday, what do I have to do to get that money back? So if I have to start applying for grants to get this little thing here to pay for this, everything that walks out of my door, I'm looking for a funding source to show them, hey, I'm putting that money back into that account. I'm not just, running and running and running and not do anything to build that money back up. We'll never be profitable. That's not what we're here for. But if I can show that I'm spending $1 and I'm making 25 cents, usually my council is pretty happy when I go to them and I'm like, hey, so can you give me $75? I'll give you 25 back. And usually they'll say, yeah, sure, have at it.
That's really great. Before I put Scott on the spot, I'm gonna brag a little bit on Kelsey's behalf. Whit mentioned using Pride as a way to persuade people to give you money. And one thing that One Alliance allows you to do is to filter very similar organizations by different kinds of data. And so this is the view for Washington Parish. And you can see in this section on the right that when we look at their save rate compared to peer organizations, they are doing really excellent work. So even in those really challenging circumstances with budget, and I know a couple of you were saying like that what Kelsey was saying really resonated with you, you can do it, but it's got to be framed in the right way that really appeals to them. With that, I'm gonna talk to you now, Scott. So will you please tell us one thing that you're really proud of, a pitch for funding that you made that was successful, why it was successful, and what the impact was?
So the first thing that I would like to let everybody know is that I collect any kind of data, even if I don't know what I'm going to use it for, because someday I'm going to use it. And if I don't collect the data today, I don't have any history. So, collect everything you possibly can, because someday you'll probably want to use it. I'll share two things that I'm sort of proud about, which is one that everybody can do, and the other one will show you what happens when you do this really well. So the first one is pet retention programs. When you monetize what it costs to take an animal into the shelter, care for it for X number of days, give it medical, give it surgery. For our community, it runs between $550 and $600. And when I look at the retention, I can get aid to most pet owners that are thinking they have to turn their pet in for between $100 and $200. So when I present that to the board or the people, I'm representing that as a $400 savings for every one that we keep out of the shelter. And, it started off very small, but right now we're probably keeping almost 2,000 animals out of our shelter at a rate that's cheaper than if they were coming in. And that's a big thing, because those are also people that become very, very grateful, and they like to tell people about all the great things you're doing and tell the commissioners that you're the best department that they have, things like that. So the other thing I'll just touch on briefly, um, we have always been very driven by results. I started in the private sector, and I'm very mindset of profit. Even though this business is not profit, the bottom line, you can make it such, because I figure my bottom line is the amount of animals that I'm saving. And so you're trying to maximize that, just like you would try to maximize your profit. So when I took over here, we were at like a 48% save rate. In 7 months, we were at 76%. And within a year and a half, we were over 90. And I was proud of that and thought, hey, now we can coast. And my county administrator said, well, I always hear you talking about 90. What would it take to do 95? And my initial answer was a miracle. And the second was, I'm not sure we can even do it. And he said, put together a business plan, show me what you need and what the results will be. So it was a major project. It probably took me several months to kind of estimate. I covered the whole gambit. So what I presented to him was, if you want me to make 95, I'm going to need 24 more employees and 2.4 million additional dollars, which is about 25% of our budget. And I was hoping maybe I'd get 5 or 10% of that, and I could incrementally move it. I got all of the money, and then I was scrambling to figure out, how am I going to get 95? Because I just promised them if they gave me everything, I would get them 95. And I'll tell you, within a little over a year, we were at 95 for dogs. Took us a little bit longer with cats because our veterinary society here was anti-community cats. So it took me a little bit longer to kind of get everybody okay with what we call returning them to their outdoor home. And, but, so when you get good at this, everybody's going to start small, but the sky can be the limit if you're good enough at presenting your data. I love the fact that there are data collection. I've been doing this for almost 30 years, and 30 years ago, there were no shelter pet data alliances and things like that out there. So I had to kind of sell my stats compared to my stats, or maybe compared to a neighboring community. I'd love to be able to compare nationally or similar size, similar construct type of things, because most politicians want their community to be the best. And so if it can be aspirational for you, hey, look at neighboring communities saving 5% more than we are, but we're better than them. We should be saving more than they are. The other side is, when you get very good accomplishments, to be able to show how you're outdoing your industry or outdoing your surrounding shelters is a way to keep the money flowing in. And so, the one thing that I always do is, pet people spend lots of money, and you have to quantify that, because people don't think of, let's say, the average pet owner spending $2,000 a year on your pets. And I'm adopting out over 10,000 animals. So that's 10,000 times 2,000. That's a lot of money that's going into my economy. And most of your politicians are business owners. They either small business owners or they work for a big corporation. They understand dollars. So what I like to do is always talk about community prosperity. That can be money, or that can be attracting people there. on the positive side, it's always about what it's going to be. And this is probably a little bold for some people. On the negative side, I talk about, if you don't give me this program, this is how many animals are going to be killed in the shelter. And that usually, after the, it usually, it resonates. For some reason, the deaths resonate more than the lives saved. And there's this weird perception in the non-animal world that saving a pet is cheaper than euthanizing it. And it really isn't. It's the right thing to do. It's clearly the morally right thing to do. But what you have to sell is, if that pet died, there's nothing going into the economy. But if that pet lives, $2,000 more of food being sold, veterinary care, resorts, whatever people spend it on, we drive as much money into the economy as like a sports team, but nobody sells it that way.
Scott, you've got to write a book. Like, there's so much that is to be pulled out there, and to congratulate you on. One part that really touched me was sometimes talking about animals in terms of money can feel really gross. And you talked about your profit is lives saved. You took that gross connection and made it really positive and focused on the animals. So really appreciate that. I'm going to move on to the part of the webinar where I ask a question and any of you can answer or not answer. So jump in as you see fit. Rosalie asked us to really start at the beginning. So you are creating a budget for the very first time. In Rosalie's case, they're trying to plan for emergency vet care, plan for the unexpected, but you could also start kind of anywhere. It's your first time doing this. It's your first time creating this kind of organization. What are the top 3 things you would do to start budgeting?
So the first thing I would do is you've got to look at how many animals are you going to care for, or do you think you're going to care for, and start quantifying what you need to make things reasonable. And if you did less, you sell it as if you did less. It's really not appropriate. This is the minimum. And so I always say, under promise and over achieve. So if you think you can save 80% this year, tell them you can save 75% and hope you save 85%, because you're going to look like you're a genius when you undersell. But when it comes to budgeting, I tend to try to pad my asks for more than what I really need. And that's because, for whatever reason in the current economy, they always want to show reduction. And so if I tell them I need 120% of what I really need, when they cut 10%, I'm still doing pretty well. And they honestly aren't going to drill down that far to know. And when the times get really rough, because I lived through the 2008 downturn, which was mass slaughter. I lost 30% of my employees overnight to cuts. But if you keep a focus on what you're doing, and how it's reacting, you have to also know how it's reacting. If your message isn't getting through, you really need to try to change it on the fly. And I know that's hard. When I first started, most people won't believe this because they see me talking and see me in this. I'm an incredible introvert. And when I had to first go present in public and I had to go defend a budget, I swear to God, I couldn't eat because I was afraid I was going to throw up. And if I didn't have anything in my stomach, there was nothing to throw up. Over time, I've gotten very comfortable with it. So, my work persona is more extroverted, but my home persona is still very introverted. But, start with the basics. And then you can always say, if you give me this additional money, I can enhance, but this is what I need to just get by. and here's what the enhancements would be.
I would echo what Scott's saying. I think those are all really great points. And in terms of where you're starting, lean on the network and reach out to other organizations that are similar in size to what you're expecting you will be, and see how they've spent money historically. And it will vary depending on, the kinds of animals that you're taking in, on your community, on cost, but it can be a good place to have a starting point, is to see what other shelters are spending. And you can use One Alliance to help identify other shelters that are similar in size to what you're expecting that you're going to be intaking, and then use that as a tool to figure out who to reach out to. And in my experience, people are very generous with sharing those kinds of resources and experience, because we want, as an industry, to help lift each other up. Because if we're all advocating for ourselves from a budget standpoint, we're going to be more successful.
Yeah, and you can definitely also if you're thinking about specifically for emergency cases further on down the line, obviously you can't say we're going to have 3 broken bones this year. But what you can do is you can call your local vet offices, the vets that you work with, and say, if we came in emergency with a broken leg that had to be amputated, what is your cost? And you get that cost. Can you itemize that cost for me? They itemize that cost. So then you go to a partner, you go to a humane society, you go to a corporation, and you ask them, this is how much it's going to cost us to get this emergency amputation done, this blood work done, this, or this. Here's the itemized bill or quote, not bill, because you haven't had it done yet. Here's this itemized quote that we're going to, this is the price that we were promised. And you can even get that in an MOU, in a contract from the vet. This is the price that you promised us. And see if they would be willing to sponsor in the event of that happening. So when you do have your, cat that comes in that has a broken back leg because it got caught in a door somewhere, you already know, okay, well, Tractor Supply is going to sponsor this cat, and you call up Tractor Supply and you'd be like, hey, remember when I came to you in 22 and you said that you were going to do this? Well, it's finally happened. And so now I need that money. And because you have it in writing and everything has been taken care of, and you have a backlog of paperwork and everything's been itemized with the vet, this emergency has been paid for and you get it off your plate.
That's a really amazing way to be proactive and to get ahead of how unpredictable animal sheltering is. So far, we've talked about successes. I've made you all brag about yourselves, but I'm guessing you have also had instances where you asked for money and you were denied. So if that happens, when it happens, what do you do to make sure that next time you ask, you do get that money? How do you respond to a no?
I think one of the things that I've done, especially if you're trying to enhance your services, and that's why they said no, because we don't have to give you any more money to do more different things, is you can turn around and tell them the next time, it's a pilot project and I'm going to do it for X number of years. So you're only committing to, let's say, a 2-year pilot project. And they're more willing to try things if they don't have to commit and say, well, I'm going to have to do this for every year for the next 20 years. And hopefully you've designed your program to a point where your results are then going to justify the continuation. But you buy yourself a couple of years of time to get that program up and running before someone says it's failing or succeeding. So sometimes it's how you repackage it. Sometimes it's, hey, you didn't give me this last year. I could have brought another 100 adoptions to this town, which would have been another, $20,000 into the economy, into the tax base, into whatever. So I'm asking for it again and hoping that, that I'm going to get it. So.
And with pilot programs, you can also consider, is there another organization externally that would fund that, even at a smaller scale, so that you could collect data and say, I brought this to you last year, you said no, but I got this local family foundation to fund it for 100 animals or 10 animals or whatever you're able to secure. And this is what the impact was. This is the data that we got from that. And so I'm going to ask you again now, with a proven track record, that this will work, for funding to do this on a larger scale, or for funding to do this a larger pilot for 2 years, to Scott's point.
Yeah, and sometimes, especially with me specifically, you have to be a little bit sneaky. So let's say you're trying to expand by like $100,000, which to a lot of us, that's a massive, that's like 3 more employees. Most likely, if you walk into your council meeting and you say, I want $100,000, here's all my data, here's everything, they're going to hear that number, they're going to say no. Already have a backup plan in place, have plan B with you in hand, in paperwork, and say, well, okay, you can't give me 100,000, but what about 2 employees and 75,000? And then all of a sudden they're like, well, that's not as bad, that's not as much as $100,000. So kind of look forward to your plan B and already have plan B. If they say no, already have something else there to give to them. So that way you have another option, because a lot of times they'll say yes to the second option because they don't want to hear you talk anymore. They're like, okay, let's move on with the meeting. I want to go home and watch football. So sometimes that works.
I love that all of Casey's answers are like, they didn't know what they were getting into when they hired me. It's like really cute. Let's talk about some specific programs and what kind of data you would pull in order to get that. So one is really talking about life-saving in general. And Sarah wants to know, how do you calculate an estimated number of dollars per euthanasias? So like, how are you calculating this is the value add by saving these lives? How are you calculating the cost of that euthanasia?
So determining the cost of the euthanasia, the hard cost is easy enough to figure out. The quantification that's a little bit more difficult is employee turnover, morale, burnout, whatever non-easily dollar amount, but you can try to quantify that. When it comes to the other side, I use some sort of a national number, like the Animal Pet Producer Product Association will tell you how much they think the average pet owner spends, and they'll sometimes break it down. And then, so you just simply multiply that times the number of animals that you're saving, and that gives you that ballpark number. It's sometimes hard to find those numbers, but if you drill down, they're out there in a lot of different ways. They are because somebody else will have taken that data and write an article on it. And so then you'll be able to get an article. And if you know your community, you should know what your lawmakers or funders are interested in. So if they're conservative, pick a conservative publication and say, look, they said this. If they're more progressive, you can pick just about anything, but you want to make it the audience accept what you're giving them as rational numbers. And, worst case scenario, you go with your $2,000 an animal and be willing to say to people, yeah, I don't know if everybody spends that much, but just imagine if they spent $1,500. It's still this gigantic number compared to what they're investing. And the one thing you have to remember, especially for municipals, is there's very few departments that return to the county, that most are money holes. They don't give back. And you are definitely enhancing the community, not only the quality of life by attracting businesses and stuff because they like what they hear about you, but you're literally keeping veterinarians, pet stores, all in business. And there's not, Public Works can't really say that, a road is a road, but if I'm saving 2,000 animals and now I'm saving 10,000 animals, I can say, hey, that is one big economic impact that I gave you. And don't forget, that's not a 1-year impact. So, that animal is probably going to live 10 to 15 years, depending on what it is. So you're talking every year for the next 10 years, you're going to be making that impact. And so then you can go back to what we were talking about before, return on investment. And you usually can take that and calculate, for every dollar you give me, it's putting $5 back into the community. And just be prepared to justify it. You really need to have your data, know your data, and try to anticipate whatever they might ask you. Because the worst thing you can do is have them ask you something and you're not prepared to answer it. Or worse than that is you make up an answer and then it's not the right answer. I would much rather say, I'll get you that data and give it back to you, because your credibility goes right down the tube if you say X and it isn't X and it's way under what you told them.
And Scott mentioned the cost of burnout and compassion fatigue on staff with euthanasia, and that is a very big issue in our field. And Best Friends actually did a research study that's published. It's linked in the deck under the Best Friends research tab, or link on one of the last slides, where you can go in and see the research that shows that the rate of compassion fatigue and burnout in our industry compared to other high burnout industries like ER nurses, and the correlation between higher burnout and higher compassion fatigue increase the odds that that person is going to leave your organization, which you can use that kind of data. If you talk with your HR department, ask them, what is the cost? What does turnover cost? And you can use that to tell the story of how much cheaper it is to retain your employees and give them a more positive working environment than it is to rehire and to have this continual turnover. So that's kind of a resource building off what Scott was saying. And Sarah, your follow-up talking about you need to cut 12% of your budget and you want to say X number of animals' lives will be impacted. When you're cutting your 12% of your budget, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to propose, you're going to cut just 12% across the board. You can look and say, what in my budget could I cut that would get me to the 12%, but would give me where I can actually tell this story. So that could be, unfortunately, it could be staff. It could be, I'm going to cut my offsite events, and that this is the number of animal that's going to save me this amount of money, but this is the number of animals that get adopted through those offsite events. And those, looking at it in that way may make it easier for you to be able to tell that story instead of just saying across the board 12%, because that's a really difficult number to calculate.
Thank you all. So we're getting close on time, so I'm going to ask you to answer this one pretty briefly. For programs that are happening where the impacts are inside of your shelter, you probably know the costs pretty well. You know how much you're spending on animal food every month. But Ryan is asking about how do we quantify costs and value added for things like community outreach. So if you are preventing litters from being born in the future because you're doing really effective TNVR and other community cat programming, how do you quantify that to help somebody who doesn't work in this field understand the value long-term? So like specifically, what data points would you want to look for?
So I will say with our very specific because like we do so much spay neuter at the shelter. My biggest thing with getting those extended numbers, last year we did 961 owned public animals that weren't in a shelter or rescue. So how can I say that, you know, that six-month-old male pit bull would have ever caused a litter to be born? I can't say that 100%, but I can say that most likely he came from a litter, and that litter was probably 10. So I can add in those numbers and say, okay, well, we did 679 cats. 75% of those cats were female. Females get pregnant at 4 months. So every, 3, 4, 5, 6 months after that, we're seeing 4 or 5 more cats added up. And how many phone calls am I getting? When we first opened our spay neuter clinic, we were getting 35, 40 phone calls a day to get animals in. All of a sudden, we're having to make posts on Facebook asking people, where are the cats? We need cats. We have spots open. That's another way to get that data, super easy. But I think like that's one thing that Scott said pretty early on was just like, everything is data. There is not a thing that we do that's not data. How many steps does it take you from the front of the building to the back of the building? That may not be something, and I'm exaggerating, but that may not be something you think about. But if a grant ever came up to get an extra fire extinguishers or something like that, that data might help you. It seems so inconsequential, but every single thing is data, everything. So whenever you're looking at, how much you're spending here, what you're doing here, what you're achieving, how often your officers go out and give things out to the public, keep all of that. Weigh your bags. If you get donated food in that's going out to the public, you have a pet pantry, put those bags on a scale. See how much that food weighs so that you have an accurate count of how much food that you donated to the public throughout the year. Everything is data. When you're sitting at your desk and you're bored and it's been a really quiet day, think about your data. Look around your office and be like, okay, well, what can I count on? What can I see? What did I spend today? And how can I cut back on that spending and make the most use out of it? What can I keep track of? Just add more stuff to your plate. It's fine. We're great.
Great. We're going to close out in a minute with a couple more resources, but first I want to draw out a theme from what all our panelists have been saying. So Daniel asked us, we are trying to start a shelter. The county is not interested in helping us. How do we persuade the county to fund a shelter? And we don't have time to answer that question specifically, but I do want to draw your attention to something our panelists have been saying, which is like, we work in a really interesting field, but also kind of an opaque field. Someone outside doesn't necessarily know what's going on in it. They don't necessarily know what goes into making it work, and they don't necessarily know what comes out of it, other than those like cute animal photos, right? So talking to someone who's really curious, but also just doesn't know what questions to ask might be a good place to start framing your questions. So with that, I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. Best Friends has some resources to help you with this. So we've talked to you about Shelter Pet Data Alliance. Kayla put that link into the chat. You can register if you haven't already. But even beyond what we do on One Alliance automatically for you, you can get individual support from one of our data analysts. It'll probably be Maureen. Maureen is great. She lives in a lighthouse and she knows everything about sheltering and data. So she's going to be an excellent person to talk to. So that's an option available to you. Also, the Best Friends Conference is coming up in 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that. It's very soon. It's in Palm Springs, California. We would love to have you there. Scott is presenting. I met Kelsey at the Best Friends Conference last year. So it's a great place to talk to your peers and help each other become better in this. We would love to see you there. We would also appreciate if you would answer the poll that's about to show up. But I hope you have a really great rest rest of your evening, and that you get the funding to achieve all the goals that you put into the chat at the start. Thank you all.